guess if doing introductions, my name is Maddox. I'm not really a notable man. I am trialing in the Guild Infinity. They are cool dudes, and I hope I don't suck my trial. Uh, yeah, I like to talk and yap about warrior stuff. I guess you can go ahead, Mr. Dan.
Yeah, I'm Dan, or Dan War, whichever one you might know me as. I've been raiding with the newly rebuilt method since Castle Nathria, pretty much since their rebuild. Still there, will be there in War Within. I also like to yap about Warrior.
And I'm Archimtiros. Most people know me by now as a warrior class theory crafter for the last, couple decades. Simulation craft developer and a longtime mythic raider in a variety of guilds.
Alrighty, well, I guess first and foremost, let's talk about the weirdness that is the warrior class tree. The class tree's been obviously, I think we were all probably looking towards or looking forward to like an actual rework of the tree, like we saw what happened with like rogues and demon hunters, or at least that's kind of what I was expecting. But we received, as they called it, a rearrangement, and then they've since done another slight rearrangement. But one of the failings of it is, I think, our pathing is very awkward, and it's also we're still needing to path through things we potentially don't even want to get to the things we need, and that we've received kind of nothing new. That's one of the things that's kind of surprised me, that we haven't really received anything new. And even when we go eventually into the arms tree, they took talents we had and gave us technically new things, but they just took talents and broke them in half and made them new talents. I don't know. It's very weird. How are you guys feeling about it so far?
I feel like the one massive shortcoming that I want to point out, I again, we know about the whole pathing through things that you might potentially not want, and it's been brought up to them time and again. But like having to path through Shockwave as an example, Shockwave or Thunderclap in order to hit reinforced plates is pretty bad. But the very fact that they feel they can justify it by saying, "Oh well, you'll at least use Shockwave sometimes," I think is an absolute joke. Because it just shows a complete lack of creativity that they can't think of any decent replacement or a way to rearrange the tree, that we're not in a situation where we have to take something that's useful 30% of the time in a raid situation, for example. It's just, I don't understand what they're playing at. I really don't, because clearly there's creativity on the dev team, just not with us apparently. I don't get how or why, really.
Just look at the fucking mage patch notes every single week. Like, it's fucking crazy.
They get an entire novel every week. And Warrior, like, it's taken us this long to get, like, a couple of paragraphs. I don't know. So, it's the same thing in Dragonflight as well. It's just a joke at this point.
So Dan already hit on a major thing, which was the shockwave pathing, and it is odd because, yeah, theoretically it's useful in a raid situation, but if you're in a raid situation where there's something you can stun with shockwave, it is, by definition, no longer single target content. I mean, unless they add, what's the Sethrak boss from Uldaman, unless they add that into a raid somewhere, which I doubt, there's no single target boss where you're using shockwave. It has to be a multi-target boss, so that just doesn't make sense to me. And I agree. I think while the single target builds right now are in an interesting spot where they are actually passable, it is hard not to take every talent you want. Unless you're playing a Thane. Thane kind of stands alone because of their added talent tax on Thunderclap and potentially Crackling Thunder. But if you're playing a Slayer or a Colossus, it is actually hard not to take every single talent you want in a single target build. With the increased tax of Shockwave, you're getting Leeching Strikes, you're getting Second Wind, you're getting Bounding Stride, Painting Gain, like you're getting all the defense, you're getting all the offense. At most, you might drop like Leeching Strikes and Fast Footwork if you need to go into Wrecking Throw or something, but that's pretty niche, right? Maybe one boss a tier. So it's actually not a bad thing that we have to go through Shockwave. It's just a stupid thing. it's a thing where we're going to look back on that next, expansion where we're coming back into 11.0, and people are going to just say, why? And that, I think, is just a glaring oversight. And the interesting thing is, on the onset of Dragonflight Alpha, they actually told us they weren't doing giant overhauls to the talent trees. Like, the focus was hero talents. Which is actually surprising why so many other classes have gotten these giant reworks. We look at DK, just got a huge rework, or
Monk,
Mage. Monk kind of needed it. I'll allow them to be the exception. They needed a nice rework. So, but yeah, it is awkward that they gave us a rearrangement, which introduced some nice things, and also just some really odd decisions that don't seem to fill any particular. They don't solve a problem,
Yeah, because like I do agree that the shockwave path thing by itself, while it's like, well, we might have shockwave but not use it in a fight, I think is okay. I think one of the biggest one of the things that's actually harming. Sorry, let me refocus my thoughts. Because I'm thinking about the monk tree, and I'm thinking about, well, they kind of get everything they want, and then they just kind of have a couple points for whatever, right? They have utility, maybe this, maybe that. Because when I think about the trees and the class trees, and when they talk about or potentially see choice as something interesting for players to choose, that's where I go, well, if we had like 2, maybe 3 points that we could say, oh, well, let's have maybe a wrecking throw, or maybe we have an extra intimidating shout, even though it's still capped at 5 targets for some reason. Maybe we want the shockwave bonus talent if we're playing something like Colossus, because the knock-up can't be, in Mythic Plus, the knock-up isn't something that can be DR'd through stuns. And I think the biggest culprits are going to be... I don't remember the exact the talent that increases your maximum amount of rage. I think it's like Unbridled Ferocity.
Overwhelming Rage.
Yes, but I look at that talent, and then I look at Crushing Force, and then I look at the fact that Thunderclap is just not baseline, even though now all 3 specs use it. And I go, if we just had baseline Thunderclap, and then those talent points were 1-pointers, that gives us instantly 3 points of, okay, we can get Crackling Thunder if we need it for a little more throughput. You can just put that literally where the Thunderclap talent would be and just move that up. Then that allows you to go, well, maybe I want Second Wind here. Maybe I can get something like Wrecking Throw, or I don't know where Shattering Throw would ever really be useful in the PvE scenario, but that could be there. Maybe you could take Piercing Howl in specific situations. But just having like 1 or 2 more points as like something flexible that you can be like, well, maybe I want this, maybe I want this, feels more kind of like the goal of what I think it should be.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, the interesting thing there is that if you look through the mock-ups, I've already posted mock-ups of all the trees for each hero spec that I'm anticipating we would play if it went live right now. Like, this is the talent tree you would use. And every build has 2 to 3 free points. Arms actually has more most of the time, because it really doesn't need Overwhelming Rage anymore. And it's kind of interesting because with Crushing Force still affecting Slam, that would have been a really good dichotomy, because Arms would always take Crushing Force, Fury would always take Overwhelming Rage, and it's just 2 points for everyone. Unfortunately, the way it actually works out, since they've changed Crushing Force, is Arms just wants Crushing Force, Fury wants Crushing Force and Overwhelming Rage. So there's a little bit of an extra talent tax there, but every build has 2 or 3 points they can customize. With the single target build, you're really not giving up anything. You're giving up like fast footwork. You don't really care about that. It's nice, but you don't need to have it.
Yeah.
But then you get into the multi-target builds, and the multi-target raid builds, the things like Tendril or something, they're kind of the same way. You got a couple points. You could take Wrecking Throw if you want to. It's once you get into those crowd control builds, you still have a few flex points where like you can drop things. But now you're dropping defensive talents. You're not dropping fast footwork anymore. You're dropping leeching strikes, or you're dropping pain and gain. And those are non-negligible defensive benefits. They're not, impending victory, but they're still pretty good. And then you get into Mountain Thane, and Mountain Thane is just kind of a mess. Trying to do a multi-target Mountain Thane build, you literally cannot drop any talent without losing significant defensive or offensive bonuses.
Yeah, especially if you're running like recklessness, I almost wonder if they should almost look at the rage economy of Fury potentially, and then be like, well, maybe we reduce this a little bit, and maybe we make, I don't know. It just comes down to like needing that 2 points in the max rage.
Well, yeah, I think the 2 points in max rage are always going to be good for Fury because it plays a positive rage economy instead of a negative one like Arms does. But the main thing is that, and plenty of other people brought this up. There's already a big post on the forums about it, where Warriors just have a ton of offensive talents in their tree. It's like half their tree is offensive talents, and things like monks and other various specs. Shaman is a good example. They have a lot of freedom in their class tree to take exactly what they want, to take all the utility, because they only have a handful of offensive and a handful of defensive points, and then they have a ton of auxiliary effects. Warriors are the exact opposite. We don't have any auxiliary effects other than like fast footwork or intervene. I mean, there are just a couple of them, and because of that, we automatically have a ton of talents that any performative-minded player wants to take, and they have to reduce that.
I have thought about this for a while, and I've been guilty of making this comparison as well. But I feel like making a comparison to like maybe Shaman's okay, but I feel like trying to make a comparison to healer hybrid class trees is always quite tricky.
It is.
I feel like it's a lot easier for a healer hybrid to have, as you put it, auxiliary effects in their tree than it would be for a tank hybrid. Because like, what can we do? Would we become viable as an off tank potentially if we were to start to get creative and add a few more points that way, or do we just make ourselves tankier, which we already have in abundance anyway? But how does, I don't know if either of you know this, and I haven't looked myself, but how does our class tree compare to, say, DH, for example, who are in a similar position? Well, I remember playing DH for a while, and I don't think it was as bad, but I think they're in a fairly similar spot.
Well, that's the exact problem, right? All of the warrior talents are offensive or defensive in nature, because what else do we do? We don't turn into a wolf with Ghost Wolf to need a talent to speed us up and to need a talent to give us, movement impairment removable or whatever. We don't do anything special. All we do is hit shit and get hit. So you would really need to take a big step back and think about, what do warriors do that's special? And that's something Blizzard has traditionally had a big problem with, is trying to find a fantasy for warriors that exists outside of just hitting things. If you play Dungeons and Dragons, there's been a long-running, like, what do fighters do problem. Fighters are good at one thing. They're good at fighting in a game where balance demands that everybody else also be good at fighting. And that's kind of analogous to warriors and WoW, right? Like, warriors' whole fantasy is we hurt things good, but so does everybody else. So what makes them special in that regard? Like, how do you give them an auxiliary effect that makes them special, other than just giving them a ton of synergy with leap or charge, or I guess you could say like spell reflect, but that is kind of defensive, right? So it comes back to the same problem.
I feel like it's also one of those things that's kind of at the extent of what it's going to do or what it can do. If you make it do any more, then Jesus Christ, that's dangerous territory.
It's a Ret Paladin, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well,
that's the problem, yeah.
Because it's I think because I feel like because Blizzard's big on thematics, right? They like things to be this and that. I think one of the most interesting things about Warrior, honestly, is that going back to like the vanilla and all of those, one of the things that made warriors feel like warriors is you could use every single weapon. We are not committed or constrained. Like there's like in Amir Jasil, for example, you go, oh, why aren't mages using Vikesh? It's a really good weapon because they have the Dreambinder staff, because they can't use maces, right? I wonder if there's any avenue for any, not necessarily like as extensive as like if you think about Diablo, like walking arsenal or anything like that. Because having to have a bunch of multiple weapons would be a little too much. But the fantasy part and the thematics of Warrior, I feel are just in a weird spot because it's like, oh, we're the two-handy hit class, I guess. But when you think, oh, well, we can do Blood and Thunder, and then you think, oh, yeah, well, Mountain Thane, but that kind of feels like the extent of it, at least where we're at thematically. Maybe they need to do something a little more, because when you try and make things for Warrior in a creative manner for, like, new talents and stuff, it's like, well, what magically or what, like, physically can we do? Because you can say ice, like, if you look at mages, you go, oh, well, a fire mage can do all of these things. Now they can have phoenixes. Now they can have meteors. Now they can have this. Or Frost can have like glacial spike or this or path of frost. Or I mean, they even put like way back like wall of fog as like that's a pull, right? Where
So I think
yeah,
I think you're onto something with the weapon master theme, but I think we're kind of shifting topics here because when you think about it, we could add talents that reinforce the theme of like a weapon master, a walking arsenal, if you will, but they would probably be offensive in nature. So
yeah, that's true.
We're kind of getting away from the idea of like how do you make warriors a bunch of talents that aren't offensive. And for the record, I went and looked, and somebody wrote a post on the feedback forums about this. I'll link it to you later, where they broke down every class and like how many damage points they have, how many healing points they have, how many defensive points they have and stuff. And it's not exact because, you know, this guy clearly doesn't play every class and like some talents kind of overlap a little bit. But according to him, Warrior has 27 damage points, 8 defensive, 9 utility, 4 mobility. Demon Hunter, because y'all asked, has 16 damage, 11 defensive, 15 utility, and 3 mobility. So significantly less damage points there. And that's, again, that was the problem we were talking about. But if we want to shift discussion over to this weapon master thing, I think there are 2 general ways you do it. And the first is the old classic style where you have like weapon specs. Like, if you're wearing an axe, you get this benefit. If you're wearing a mace, you get this benefit. And that's cool, and it's thematic, and it's horribly imbalanced and terrible for WoW's loot
I don't
style.
see how it would fit in the current game design. Because, like, I like the idea of it. I just don't see how it would fit. And that's where I feel like why we have all of these, like you're saying, all these offensive and defensive nodes is because we're just... like,
good at hitting things.
Like our... Like, honestly, realistically, I don't, like, mind having it be this focused, because it's like, even in other games, oh, I play the two-handed big hit sword. When I play D&D, I would play either a dex or strength fighter, like pure fighter, because it's like that hit things, right?
You know, I've actually never played D&D, but I do find it fascinating.
Yeah, but I don't know if the reason why our nodes are like this are because it's difficult to try and bring some form of fantasy to a class that's just about hitting things. Because I think people like that Warrior is, oh yeah, I hit the thing. I don't really think people want them to be crazy complicated, or they don't when they play a Warrior, they don't want to think like a mage, right?
They just want a Zug.
Yeah, and I think that's actually going into what they've kind of been doing to Arms a little bit. I'm not shifting to Arms yet, but just it seems like they're almost trying to simplify, like, back to basics a little bit. It's like, you want to hit the MS. In AoE, you want to hit the cleave. Like, it feels like that's what they're trying to do.
Well, arguably Arms needs a simplification. But yeah, I agree with you. I think it was going back to my original point. You know, how do you make a class that is about hitting things suddenly about something else? Like, how do you make that utility? And that's kind of hard to do. I'm not saying we couldn't slam our brains against our desks until something useful came out, but it would take a lot of rearrangement. And I also don't mind that Warriors take a lot of offensive and defensive talents, but it does mean that anytime we want to take something else, it's a trade-off of how much offense or defense are we willing to lose for this.
Yes.
You know, some things that are quote-unquote utility, like Wrecking Throw, is actually damage. Shattering Throw is actually damage, more so than utility. When you really think about it. The only things that we really have on our tree that are quote unquote utility are CC talents, which are very specific in where they're useful. Berserking Shout, which you'll literally never use. Piercing Howl, which you probably will never use. And Fast Footwork Intervene. I mean, literally everything else is offensive or defensive in some way. So it's always an opportunity cost for warriors, is giving up seismic reverb worth the damage you get from Wrecking Throw.
Yeah, because one of the things I think exemplifies this more than anything else is our third tier of talents and our bottom towards the capstones, where that first line, it's 2-point node, 2-point node, 1-point node, 2-point node, 2-point node, which I think the 2-point nodes are fine, being that far down in the tree as almost like gatekeepy talents, because realistically, I really don't think people want to play Spear and Roar at the same time because it's optimal. I don't want to do that. That doesn't sound too great. I mean, people don't like Spear in the first place, but you look at the nodes and it's like, well, crit and execute damage, and then it's like Wild Strikes where you get haste and then 20% auto attack speed after crits. Like, that's crazy. Two-handed weapon specialization, which is just flat damage again. And then you go over and it's like, well, then you have armor to the teeth. And then the only other node in that row is endurance training, which is, you got like, oh, well, I guess it's more of a PvP talent because it's literally just plus 10% stamina. But there's almost no way you're really gonna take endurance training in almost any situation because everything else around it is throughput. And even going below like the avatar capstone, they kind of like kneecapped and shotgunned that Warlord's Torment for arms, because by taking away any form of rage generation from Colossus Smash, the point just kind of sucks. I mean, it lets you take maybe Uproar or something, or maybe even a point in endurance training potentially, but the bottom of our tree, I think, really just exemplifies that, well, you're going to take the offensive or the defensive node, and you're going to lose something down there.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to jump in on this one, Dan.
I mean, I don't know. I just keep going back to the same thing every time, and it's just absolute lack of creativity. I get that there needs to be some kind of gatekeeping, otherwise, again, as you said, we're going to end up in a position where we're playing both Spear and Roar, and like hell, does anyone want to do that? For sure. My biggest issue with that whole area of the tree is literally just the specialization point. Why is it there? Why is it there other than to be something to forcibly sink a point into because they couldn't think of anything else to go in its place? Nothing more interesting, nothing that made more sense, nothing like that. And I don't know. See, every time I look at this tree, I just get more and more depressed. It's really, really annoying.
I don't get as upset about the third tier as most people, which is a little controversial, but I do agree it would not be good if we didn't have those 2-point gates. It would not be better, because if you're playing every talent down there, you're always playing everything. You never play anything different. It just goes against the whole concept of a talent tree in the first place, right? Like if you don't have a build that plays one and then you have a build that plays the other, and every build plays all of them, where's your change in the talent tree? Where's your customization? That said, the current layout is kind of scuffed. The old layout, a lot of people have recommended going back to the old layout, the one on live, where you had Armored to the Teeth lead into Avatar, and then you had basically the choice between Wild Strikes or Cruel Strikes if you're going into Spear or Roar. And that works, but that only really works because Spear builds never take Piercing Challenge, and Roar builds can safely drop Cruel Strikes for Uproar, because Cruel Strikes is just not a strong talent. Anyway, even in a full execute single target arms build, it's not actually that strong of a talent. Then you look at Wild Strikes or Armored to the Teeth. I don't think a lot of people realize how strong Armored to the Teeth is. Like right now, if you were building, if you're building an arms build, say, and you're taking Thunderous Roar, you're taking Words, you're taking Avatar, you're probably dropping Warlord's Torment because, like you said, Blizzard took it out back and said, look at the pretty flowers. So So you're taking Uproar instead, but if you wanted to take Warlord's Torment, you would have a choice of taking Uproar or 1 point in Armor to the Teeth instead of 2, and that's like an 8% damage drop. Like, that's big. Armor to the Teeth is a huge talent. It's stronger than the dual wield specialization, or two-handed specialization, whichever you're looking at.
Yeah, because I know
That's bad. Like that, the current setup is wildly unbalanced.
Yeah, because some people, I guess the obvious like comparison, not necessarily to Armor to the Teeth, but like our armor and like our endurance training nodes, is people look over at Ret and just glare at Sanctified Plates, and like, but I don't know if having a talent like that would be too strong in the warrior tree with how much throughput and stuff we have.
Death
Anyway.
Knight's got one too now. They just buffed Veteran of the Third War, so now it's 20% stamina in the middle of the tree for 1 point.
That's okay. Well,
so Death Knight's gonna have more stamina than warriors.
All right, give me Sanctified Plates, please.
Yeah. Now Sanctified Plates suddenly looks fine.
Yeah,
and yeah, the only way they can salvage it right now is they just need to completely overhaul the balance of those talents. I don't mind those talents. I think Cruel Strikes is a little underwhelming, but on the other hand, Armor to the Teeth and Wild Strikes are way too important. Like they're huge. They're so strong you cannot drop them. And that limits your flexibility. The reason it works on live is because Cruel Strikes is something you feel fine dropping. And that's what needs to happen if they're ever going to salvage endurance training there. I with respect to Dan's complaints about, the dual wield specialization, two-handed specialization just being an extra point, like, I get it, it's boring, but I don't think that's really the root of the problem. I think it's there just because there are 11 points to spend in the class tree as opposed to 10 in the spec tree.
That's part of my problem. Like I say, it all comes down to absolute lack of creativity.
Yeah,
and
you're right.
I wouldn't be surprised if, to a degree, when Blizzard comes around to doing balance, they will absolutely 100% take the specialization point in mind when it comes to the balance, because they can just rest assured we're always going to take it. And I don't think that should ever be the case. I don't think they should ever look at a tree and go, well, they're always going to take that, so we can take that into account when we do the balancing. That doesn't make sense. It should be from the ground up. It should be from an absolute base level, not, they're definitely going to have this extra 5% damage in mind. It's just laziness.
Yeah, because I think what like makes it hurt even worse is the fact that we have received 0 new talents. Like, there's nothing new in our class tree compared to basically like almost every other class. Maybe not Shaman's class tree, because their class tree was pretty good, but because our base class tree just has received nothing new. Obviously, we've had the same, essentially the same stuff for the entire expansion now, and now we're just gonna have the same stuff again. It's just in a different shape. It's just having something new in there would just feel way better, I think.
Well, yeah, that's what happens, is when they add something new, you've got 6 months to get used to it and figure out the problems with it. And so you got that honeymoon phase, right? I think that's what they used to call it.
Yeah.
Where you're just excited about the new stuff and you're not seeing the cracks yet. And it takes a while to get there. And we've already had our honeymoon phase with these talents and with this general tree. Even though the layout's a little bit different, it's overall pretty much the same. So we've already had that honeymoon phase. We've already gotten used to identifying the problems, and they feel very close to us, whether they're necessarily the biggest problems or not. I will say, on the flip side, talking about things like Shaman, a lot of Shaman players, they don't have to take 25 talents worth of damage, but they also don't like that it doesn't really matter what they take in their tree, because they're not picking up damage or important defensives or anything anyway, right? They only have 10 balance. So that is a complaint that a lot of them levy. So there are 2 extremes to this, I think.
Yeah.
That's all good, but we're about to go into a similar situation, just with a bunch of damage that we have to take as well.
Yeah.
We're about to go into, we can take all the damage, and it doesn't matter what we take after that.
Well, that's what I mean. It's kind of a grass is greener situation. It's kind of both sides have their problems.
That's definitely been my whole problem with the tree. It has been not even necessarily with the tree itself, and I've known this for a while. I just keep gaslighting myself. It's the fact that so many other classes have received such sizable changes at a time where we were told that there probably wouldn't be that many sizable changes.
Mage.
We've had two specs that have played in a very, very similar way for 6, 8 years. I want things changed. Like I want to feel something new. I don't want to play the same thing again and again. It's now getting stale, really, really stale.
Like
I
even
still
in
love the class, but bloody hell, like throw us a fucking bone.
even in 10.0.5, they're like, oh, they changed some stuff for arms, and then it's like, all right, well, we're running literally the same single target arms build the entire expansion. Like, there's
Yeah.
no variance, no nothing. It's like, no, you're gonna
Well,
run
it
this.
did
You're gonna run this.
change. It did change between launch and 05. That's when we went from slam heavy to overpower heavy.
Yeah.
So it
I mean,
changed a little bit.
but I think actually,
But they're still pressing the same 3 buttons, so you know.
Yeah.
segueing into talking about overpower and moving more towards the arms stuff, because I think it's a good time to do that. I think they realized how much they fucked up with giving overpower way too much damage, way too much stuff, because they've been reeling back on almost at most nodes that buff that talent. Because when I'm doing keys as arms, overpower and dreadnought are like my 1 and 2. Like it's disgusting how strong that button is, and I think they realized, oh, adding once again damage amp, AoE capability that also profits off the damage amp to your filler button, and then having it do more than your actual buttons, kind of, while it's like numerically good, kind of sucks in terms of playstyle. But I guess we're gonna start off with like arms and Colossus. I guess more as a focus. It feel like I like the idea of demolish. I like the ideal of the big hit. I know a lot of people, at least like community comments, were stuck on the size increase, but that I don't. I guess your tavern mount's gonna look a little bigger now if you're playing arms, but I don't really see. Some of the Colossus flavor is kind of it's pretty stale. Colossus feels very stale to me, because it just feels like a bunch of numbers, bunch of damage amps. I mean, you do get some DR, but all the flavor for me is in demolish. And with the change to Thunderous Words, now amping bleeds within the roar window, and with how they have essentially smashed a couple talents together with fixing like Skull Splitter. Now in the single target, we're looking at like Skull Splitter, we're looking at Roar, and these things, like Roar, you can get down. It's a minute 30 or 1 minute, depending on what you're running, and Skull Splitter's 21. So they're technically going to desync themselves, but realistically, you're still just going to get everything within that Roar window anyway with Skull Splitter. But how are we feeling about Colossus, I guess? Just as a general
Colossus sucks.
Yeah, love demolish. Absolutely love demolish. Me and Archie had the same thought when Colossus was first shown. Like the whole tree,
the same thought. We share a brain cell.
Pretty much, the whole tree was going to ride or die on whether demolish was good or not, and it was right to be skeptical of Blizzard when they said, "Yeah, well, demolish is going to do huge damage. You're going to want to press it." We were right to be skeptical because, you know, it's still the same company, but man, like they've absolutely delivered. I think as of right now, Colossus is probably the one hero spec that I'd say is virtually just ready to go, outside of maybe some minor bugs. But like in terms of what it's aiming to do, it's there. It's just there. Demolish just destroyed. Demolish does exactly what it says on the tin. All of the other damage amps inside of it, I honestly don't mind because it's making our abilities hit harder, and that's also good. Like we want to see arms for ages. People who love arms want to see big numbers, especially out of Mortal Strike, and Colossus pushes that, and it pushes it really well.
Yeah, I like having. Yeah, also a small thing. One thing I do like about Colossus is the fact that you do have that like damage amp in Demolish where you're building up. I think it's called like Champion's Might or something. I don't know the exact name of the buff.
Colossal
Might, yeah. Where it's like, okay, well, you're building this up, and then you're just gonna hit with it, and it's gonna do big damage. That's honestly one of my favorite parts about it, because one of the things about the arms tree, which felt kind of weird to me, is it's like, oh, well, your martial prowess is going to buff your mortal strike. Oh, your executioner's precision is going to buff your mortal strike. Oh, you're going to have this damage amp here and this damage amp here. I almost just like the simplicity of Colossus, where it's just like, you're going to hit the button, it's going to do big damage. And I'm like, yeah, well, I want to do the big damage, so...
That's kind of where I'm at. That's kind of where I'm at with it. There are hero specs which do a lot of things, and they've got a lot of myriad effects. You know, I look at, I don't know, Riders of the Apocalypse for Death Knight, right? You can summon 3 different Death Knights, and they all do 3 different things, and if you do this thing while one of them is out, it does this, and if you do another thing while another one's out, it does this. They do a lot of stuff, right? And then I look at Colossus, and it does one thing. But it does that thing really well, and as long as it does that one thing really well, I'm pretty happy. It is kind of elegance and simplicity, and as Dan said, all of us were very skeptical. I think when I did my initial write-ups of, like, this is my, Wowhead review of what the hero talent looks like based on the initial presentation before we had a chance to test it, and I was like, this is boring. Like, okay, Demolish sounds cool if they deliver, but everything else is boring. But then when I actually played it, I was like, wow, okay, I don't have to care about 9 different things. I just want to watch Demolish and hit Demolish, and everything else just works.
I think something going... Or, sorry. I was going to say, something I think actually working against Colossus when it was announced and when people saw it was Fire Laugh. Just the idea of another channeled spell like the Firalath active, especially when it was very almost not worth pressing to a degree early on before they buffed it. I think that negatively affected people's idea of what Colossus and Demolish was as.
Yeah, Demolish, I will say, is basically better Firalath. They've certainly gone through an effort to make it more user-friendly. For one, it's hasted from the get-go. We don't have to wait a bunch of patches for that. It's shorter to begin with. And also, I posted a Twitter thread with a series of
you can
videos.
Fucking leap during it.
Yeah, you can do everything during it. You cannot move, which I get is a real breaking point for some people, but you can leap during it, you can charge during it, you can intervene during it, you can use all your defensives during it, you're immune to stuns and stuff during it. Like, you've got a lot of freedom, short of just actually letting you move. Blizzard did pretty much everything they could to let you play around that very short route, because with haste, we're talking like a second and a half, a second 0.6. It's not significant. But just talking about the theme, I think Colossus sells itself really well because Demolish feels good. And it's certainly not going to be, if you look at a details damage breakdown, it's not going to be 40% of your damage. It's not even going to be 20% of your damage. I think normally when I'm testing, I think it's somewhere around 13 to 16% of my damage between the 3 hits, which is still a respectable amount. But if you talk about like max hit, it's doing like 4 times what my max mortal strike is.
Yeah.
It's pretty beefy. And if you use actually, one of my friends is a weak aura that combines things like multi-hit attacks like Whirlwind or Demolish and stuff like that in a 1 damage number instead of multiple. Then you can really start to see the power, because he'll post screenshots where he's getting multi-million crits out of this thing, like 15 million and stuff out of the Demolish. I mean, it's juicy. So
this is without a potential raid fight damage amp window too. So
sure, yeah. If you were to line this thing up on like Smolderon, just like we do with the Firalath axe, it puts out. I will say there are some cracks. For one, lining up all these different things. You brought up Thunderous Words and Skull Splitter. They technically misalign, but they also kind of align because they're very similar. The same thing can be said for Demolish. Demolish is a 45-second cooldown, which aligns with Colossus Smash. But where Colossus Smash is reduced by anger management, Demolish is just reduced by pressing Mortal Strike. And so they're reduced at a different rate there. And if you're just trying to line up Colossus Smash and Demolish, that's not too hard to focus on. But if you're trying to line up Colossus Smash and Demolish and Skull Splitter and Colossus Smash and Skull Splitter and Thunderous Roar and Colossus Smash, it starts to get a little overwhelming. And there are certainly some spots where I'm just like, I don't know if, do I want to use Skull Splitter now? Do I want to wait for the Demolish and this, that, and the other? So it gets a little chaotic when you're actually playing it. And I'm sure we'll come up with some ground rules once we get into something like, just always press X and on cooldown and always wait for Y. But it's not necessarily as simple as it sounds just by reading it, is what I'm trying to say, when you get into the actual gameplay.
It's a little messy.
You could call it messy, and it certainly is, but it also gives you something to think about when you're playing it. And I think that's important for a spec that really only has like 4 or 5 main damage buttons in the first place that are mostly just pressed on cooldown, right? I think giving people something to think about, like, what am I going to do next, is important, messy or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I like the return of Skull Splitter, just because I've honestly never really just been a fan of the button. It's more of a personal thing. But maybe it's just because I was used to running it on like Senarth or something, and I just hated Senarth.
I think it's a lot better now that it just doubles bleeds instead of ticking them out instantly, because you're no longer in that situation of like, I'm double tapping Rend and dumb gameplay.
What about?
Would you believe that that's apparently a very contentious point?
What about
I've had multiple arguments with people who preferred the old version. I don't get why.
I guess it was just for burst damage. I've seen some people just like the idea of burst windows, but
it just does the same thing over a slightly longer period of time and gives you more control.
Yeah,
and means you don't have to spend a ridiculous amount of rage on reapplying bleeds, reapplying bleeds again. It's just
actually
much better gameplay loop.
Talking about rage spending, the overhaul to our rage, I'm looking forward to the 5th, because I'll finally actually be able to touch it myself. I've been checking every week for alpha, actually wanting to be able to touch these things and play them. But with the beta coming out, I'll finally actually be able to actually touch these things. So I'm really looking forward to that. But with how's the rage economy felt? I know, and it might be kind of weird in Execute, I'm guessing, just because Execute can still go up to 40. But how does the rage economy feel for Arms?
For the most part, especially my earlier testing, truth be told, I've not really touched it in like 2 weeks or so. But in the earlier part of testing, it felt like nothing had really changed. You could still use your abilities when you wanted to. That was fine, but you weren't staring at a completely full rage bar the entire time. So I think for the most part, they've kind of hit the mark pretty well. There are some times where you'll starve yourself and maybe have to charge weave, but they are nowhere near as egregious as we've had previously. So that'll probably help a lot of people. You're right, Execute is just an metric ton slower. But I think that's also kind of fine if we are going to have a lot more damage shifted into Mortal Strike, for example. If it's moved out of Execute specifically as well, which it's not really, but I guess as a byproduct it probably will be. If Mortal Strike itself is doing more, then I guess it's probably going to balance out in the end anyway. But I feel like they've kind of hit the mark all right.
Yeah, I'll say I think Rage Generation feels good on the beta. I think they did hit the mark. In my testing, it depends a little bit on what build you're playing, and Skull Splitter is kind of integral to keeping up that rage, because it is a rage generator, in addition to just being a global that you're not spending rage on. So it does help keep it up a little bit. But in my testing, I only ever have maybe, if I get an unlucky amount of exhilarating blow procs, I get maybe 1 GCD every few minutes that I can't fill. And maybe I'll have to charge for, just because I didn't get Tactician procs, or because I got too many Mortal Strike procs. So the way they changed it, every single button except Mortal Strike and Execute costs 20 rage. Even Ignore Pain is only 20 rage. Mortal Strike costs 30. Execute, we know, scales up to 40. And because of that, there's no more, do I press Thunderclap because it spends more rage? Do I press Whirlwind to dump all my rage? It's just very straightforward. You press Mortal Strike, you press Overpower. If you need to fill GCDs, you press Slam, obviously keeping up Rend and whatnot. So if you're doing that though, and you're actually using your full gambit of abilities, you really don't ever rage out of rage. In most cases, I found it's actually slightly rage positive, and during, or sorry, exhilarating blows is really the limiter there. If you get a lot of procs because Mortal Strike spends 30 instead of 20, you'll actually start to dip negative in rage a little bit, but it kind of controls itself. You're not going to get 5x streaks very often.
Yeah.
If you do have excess rage, though, that's where Ignore Pain comes in. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. I can show you some screenshots. I don't know if you want to throw them up in the video or anything, but with my rage economy, generally speaking, like I'm hovering around 50, 60, 70 rage, sometimes dropping down to like the 40 mark or even the 30 if I'm starting it a little starved. And that's pretty healthy to be throughout the entirety of, like a 6-minute fight.
And was that testing with Wind Fury or without?
No, that's without. So if you have Wind Fury, I don't think Wind Fury is going to be important to Arms again, at least outside of Execute.
Yeah.
I was going to say. It's going to be another one of those things that all the sims will need to be Execute specific for that one, because, Arms is still Arms. It's still going to have a very meaty Execute phase. So
my thing is that I think, honestly, if anything, I think their rage economy is still slightly high. However, I don't think that's a bad thing, because like I said, it opens up a room for you to use Ignore Pain. And that is important, because if you don't have the rage to use Ignore Pain, why does it exist, right? You're just not going to use it if it significantly detracts from your DPS. But the way it's set up right now, I think in most cases it's actually slightly rage positive. And that's not including things like Ravager, right? Ravager gives you a ton of extra rage that you honestly can't spend. So it's not nearly as important as it is for Fury, dropping Recklessness and Ravager at the same time and getting a crap load of rage to just spam Rampage. Arms, I like that they have Ravager, because it gives them an option away from Execute, like if we had another Sylvanas type fight, but I don't think it'll be nearly as important to have in every single build. Execute is the problem. Once you get into Execute, you rage starve. And I was talking about that graph, where I'm sitting at like 60 rage most of the time, and this is without playing overwhelming rage. I just don't think you really need it as Arms. But once you get in the Execute phase, like I'm hovering around like 20 rage, because I just can't generate enough to keep up with Execute spending all of it every other GCD or whatever.
Yeah, because the kneecapping to Warlord's Torment definitely, I think, affects that, especially for Execute window. But on the flip side, the buff to End for the Kill, where it actually follows the full duration of your... Well, not technically full duration, because I think, what was it with like Spiteful Serenity or whatever, it would do 23 instead of 26, something like that. But with End for the Kill actually lasting the duration of your 13-second Colossus Smash, I think that's also something way better. And I hope a lot of people are wanting to move away from this test of might gameplay, which definitely reducing the cost of the abilities is probably going to make In for the Kill way more interesting in a lot of scenarios.
Yeah, In for the Kill is generally better than Test of Might right now, from what I've seen. That might change a little bit, and again, if you got Wind Fury, you've got a lot of excess rage, and maybe you can do something there, but with everything costing 20 rage, there's no real scaler. So having extra rage isn't actually that important if you're already filling all of your GCDs anyway. It basically just translates into more Ignore Pain. The main thing for me is, as we said, the Execute phase, and the loss of Warlord's Torment is very keenly felt there, and that's why my favorite solution... There are currently 3 talents that control Rage and Execute, right? There's Critical Thinking, which gives you the refunds. There's Improved Execute, which gives you refunds. And there's Finishing Blows, which gives you Rage when you use Overpower sub 35%. Those can all be tweaked to make Execute feel good. They've usually done that several times in the past. They went through the same thing in Dragonflight Alpha when Arms was very rage-starved. My favorite solution, though, is just allow Warlord's Torment to affect Colossus Smash again, but only if it hits a target below 35%. And then you can reclaim that time to go fast moment when you use Colossus Smash during execute, and it also salvages that talent a little bit, because otherwise it's probably dead.
Yeah, most of the time you're probably running Uproar, and in a single target situation, that also helps it align with Skull Splitter in the current iteration. So it's I do think that would be a way to salvage that talent, because no, you're not running Warlord's Torment. But moving towards Slayer now, since we're talking about execute so much. They recently changed the. It was called Frenetic Flurry. I think it's like Reap, the something now. The procced Blade Storm now is off of Mortal Strike for arms, which I think is interesting instead of Overpower, and it's a flat percent instead of proc per minute, which is another. I don't know if honestly whether it's a buff or nerf. I don't know. I don't really think it matters. But I do think the change is kind of interesting.
So
yeah, I'd say it's for sure a buff. I think moving away from RPPM for something like that is very advantageous in terms of keeping up overwhelmed stacks specifically. The whole change from Overpower to Mortal Strike in particular is not that big of a deal. I don't think you were using them both basically as much as you could anyway, so you were going to get all the procs that you could have done out of it. But the change to percentage, I think, is insanely good. I don't know if I've just overread it, but I feel like it's insanely good anyway. The outcome's just going to be more overwhelmed stacks or longer maintenance of overwhelmed stacks. But I found in single target that overwhelmed stacks weren't really that much of a problem anyway. I don't know if you found similar or not, Archie, but I never had an issue. AoE was a problem, but single target, never. I could have 3-4 minutes of maintaining full stacks without an issue.
Yeah, so Reap the Storm is the new name, and they changed the talent up a little bit. Well, not the name so much as the tooltip, to inform players that it's not actually casting Blade Storm. It's just a kind of fake Blade Storm that just has the animation and does some damage. Changing it to percentage instead of RPPM was actually a dramatic buff, but it was mainly done for Fury rather than Arms. For Arms, you were pressing Overpower more or less on cooldown anyway, and you continue to do the same for Mortal Strike, so you were maxing out that 2 ppm, which is what it was previously, which is roughly, before haste, 1 proc every 30 seconds. Being a 20% chance is of course a lot more procs because you use Mortal Strike and Overpower very often. The problem was that Fury had it procking off Bloodthirst, and Fury didn't have to use Bloodthirst that often. I mean, pressing Bloodthirst twice a minute is not, that doesn't really play into their idea of Fury should use Bloodthirst regularly. So changing it to a percentage is actually a really elegant change that by itself forced Fury to, okay, we actually want to press Bloodthirst regularly now.
Yeah, because
for Arms it doesn't really matter.
Because it seems like we'll go into a little more when we get to the Fury thing, but it seems like they're like, hey, Slayer, Bloodthirst, Thane, Raging Blow. It's like, all right, you want to hit these buttons for these specs, and I guess it makes it better for both of them, but I don't know.
There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about when we get to
I will say there is a downside to this change for Arms, though. Changing it from Overpower to Mortal Strike did introduce a problem that is kind of overlooked at first glance, and that's if you're playing multi-target, if you're playing a cleave build, Slayer now has the same problem that Arms has, in that if you're pressing cleave, you're not pressing Mortal Strike. So you're not getting those Reap the Storm procs, or if you're playing Colossus, you're not getting those Colossal Might stacks to make your Demolish stronger and reduce its cooldown. And so it is a problem that they need to fix. And I think that's a place where they are still iterating. I know we're about to go into beta, and it feels like they need to be done with everything, but we're far from done here. There are still going to be some changes. They probably won't do sweeping overhauls, and if at this point you're still holding out hope for, a mage, monk, Death Knight level rework, you might want to stop huffing the copium. But there is still room for changes, and I think that's a place we'll see it, because the multi-target Arms builds that are really heavily focused on cleave have kind of kind of a weird opposition to one another right now, where like the hero talents are telling you press Mortal Strike to get this cool effect, but then Cleave is telling you press it every 3 seconds and you don't have time to do anything else.
It's like
and it's even weirder for Colossus, because Colossus gets a whopping 25% damage bonus on top of another 20% damage bonus. So like pressing Cleave is huge. It's like 50% of your damage as Colossus.
Yeah, because
I know the solution for AoE on Reap the Storm looks simple in that it would be just add Cleave. But if you add Cleave on the same percentage, suddenly you're running Cleave in single target as well, potentially.
That is a possible, yeah. That is a possibility.
That will be no bueno. I don't want to be doing that, I'll be honest.
It's potentially even a thing for Colossus, right? You know, if you get Colossal Might stacks from Cleave, why would you not just press Mortal Strike and then Cleave instead of
Slam?
Exactly. Now, you could handicap that. You could do something like when Cleave hits 2 targets, it procs a stack of this, or, you know, Reap the Storm or whatever, but it's something to think about, and I'm sure we're going to see some more iteration there, because that is a pain point that's been caused by switching that over to Mortal Strike.
Yeah, because in their like I said, dumbing down of it, where it's like single target, Mortal Strike, AoE, Cleave, because it's the AoE rotation of arms was just an absolute mess of, do you press Dreadnought here? Do you have Sweeping Strikes? Do you press Whirlwind? Do you have Sword of Storms Whirlwind? Oh, well, we don't have Sword of Storms. Like, it wasn't, I think one of the issues with it, not that it was too difficult to do, but I think the design just wasn't intuitive on like, oh, I press this in this situation, which I think is their goal, which is why they're changing and buffing these things. But Colossus, I guess for arms, Colossus just feels like you opened up a brand new package and it's just good right out of the box, right? That's for, in most situations, it just feels that way. And for Slayer, it feels a bit more weird. There is obviously for Slayer the talent point tax of taking Bladestorm over other things, especially in like a single target setting, just because you need to have it for it to work. Which it's not like the craziest thing, like it's not that big of a deal. But as we're getting into the talent point tax, when we get into Thane, it's going to be a big problem.
Technically, you don't have to have Bladestorm for it to work. You just lose like effectively 2 halves of 2 hero talents within Slayer. There would be a way to make it work, but you do kind of handicap yourself a little bit if you do it.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be worth not running Bladestorm.
No, of course, I don't.
It is odd though. Part of it is a tree pathing problem right now, because you have to go through critical thinking to get the sharpened blades, to get the execution precision. You can't get there from Bladestorm anymore. But regardless of what the pathing looks like, if you're taking Bladestorm in a potential Slayer build, you're also going to take Hurricane. I mean, that's just an absolute. You're never giving that up if you're taking Bladestorm. But to take those, you have to drop something, right? And the obvious ones are Fatality, Juggernaut, maybe Battlelord now that they've nerfed it. And the nerf was actually a very good change. But you might drop that. But you have to drop something, and that's odd because you're taking away from ARM's core capabilities. You know, its execute, or its Fatality is basically Mortal Strike damage, even if it happens in execute. You're taking away from its core damage to add Bladestorm, so that Bladestorm needs to add a significant amount of damage, and I'm not really sure if it gets there or not. Bladestorm does kind of fuck now that they've buffed it up. It does a good amount of damage, but it is still spread out over several GCDs. And I don't know. I'm not actually sure if the tuning is quite there yet for ARMS. I think Fury's a little bit better off in that regard. Some of the things are also, you know, it's just we got to get more testing in, and some things are bugged. For example, anger management does not properly reduce the cooldown of Bladestorm right now, so it's a little hard to test that. I also think that a big thing for Slayer is that it gets a lot of its single target oomph out of sudden death procs and their interaction with Slayer's dominance, the whole marked for execution thing. You You get stacks of Marked for Execution, you consume them with Execute, and that reduces the cooldown of your Blade Storm and applies Overwhelm, does other stuff. Like, that's a cool loop, but it's a little goofy right now, and I'm sure Dan could talk about more about that, because he actually had a brilliant solution to it that has been brought up with the developers.
Yeah, so obviously we know the way this works right now is Marked for Execution stacks are a debuff on your target, which on single target, 2 target, not really that much of a problem. On AoE, it's going to become a fiesta, because you are going to, every time you get a sudden death proc, in order to actually take advantage of the Bladestorm CDR. So I'll put it in the context of Fury for 1 second. I know we're on Arms at the moment, but just to like properly contextualize it. So Fury at the moment, if you cleave and execute with sudden death and it cleaves another target with 3 stacks of Marked for Execution, it won't give you the CDR. I'm assuming they've done that so that the CDR doesn't go wildly out of control and you're like, you know, execute cleaving 6, 7 stacks and getting all that CDR, and then it just goes wildly insane, which is all well and good. But the problem is you're now going to be effectively whack-a-moling your executes onto the targets you want CDR from, which is a huge issue in AoE, especially as you start adding more and more targets into a pull, which in some of these dungeons is very possible. So the solution that I had was a fairly simple one, and it was to turn Marked for Execution from a debuff on the target into a buff, and also allow it so that whenever you have 3 stacks of Marked for Execution, just proc and execute. It's just a normal execute, so for Fury, nothing would really change. It would be as if you had sudden death, but for Arms, it would still cost you it would still cost you potentially 20 to 40 rage based on whatever you're at the time. That way, you're not having to play whack-a-mole in AoE anymore, and you can actually just focus on you and just track stacks instead, which I feel like is much neater than trying to track 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 different targets, you know?
It's like the old combo point issue, where the combo points were on the target.
More or less, yeah.
The other benefit to that, too, is that currently with Slayer's Dominance, which is the thing that actually procs Marked for Execution, has its own proc rate, right? It's 7 ppm, which is very generous. You get a lot of those procs, but the problem is Sudden Death has a completely different proc rate, right? It with Imminent Demise, which increases it, I think it's 4.25 ppm. No, I'm sorry. It's that's season 1. It's like 3.5 or something. Yeah. It's not bad, but it's not particularly high. And the point I'm getting at, the numbers don't really matter. The point I'm getting at is they're independent. So what happens is, inevitably, you either get a bunch of Marked for Execution stacks, and you go over 3, and you overcap, and you waste some of them before you ever get a Sudden Death proc to consume them, or sometimes you get 2 Sudden Death procs in a row before you've generated any more Marked for Executions, and you're not getting anything out of it. It's just really wonky. And as Dan said, like, it might spread out, right? You might get 1 stack on this target, 1 stack on that target, 2 stacks on that target, and now you're using like mouse over macros to try to snipe the high execute, mark. It's just weird. By marrying the 2 and just making it where every 3 Slayer's Dominance procs you get execute, it streamlines the whole process, and it makes it very predictable in a way. I mean, it's still RNG controlled by Slayer's Dominance, but it's very straightforward in that, like, proc, execute, right? It's not, I've had times where I'm hitting a target dummy and Marked for Execution has a 30-second cooldown, and it'll have 30-second buff, and it'll have like 5 seconds remaining by the time I actually get a freaking Sudden Death proc. It's just kind of crazy. Like, dry streaks happen. So I really like the idea of marrying those 2 just because it streamlines the whole process and makes it a little more predictable.
And especially making it not a sudden death proc specifically, and an actual cast also goes into the rage economy of Arms as well, which I think is a super, super good solution.
As long as Arms isn't starved for rage, and it currently isn't, yeah, that's fine. It does kind of lose a little bit of value in the execute phase because you can use execute anyway, but I don't know if that's necessarily a problem, and you are getting benefits because you're using execute all the time anyways.
Yeah. On single target specifically, that was just going to be something that would happen regardless, even with the current iteration.
Yeah,
So I don't think it's that much of an issue.
Yeah, I don't think it's that much of an issue because the main thing is that Slayer's dominance is consumed by any execute, not just sudden death execute. So you're going to be consuming those marks in execute regardless of those procs. It's really the big difference is that right now execute is rage starved, so extra sudden death procs during execute actually are very useful. And this change would undermine that. However, I fully expect they are going to address this execute problem. They're not going to leave it this rage starved because it really is anemic to play. It's not good.
Yeah, I showed those graphs earlier, and like you're just sitting at about like 25 the whole time, and you're just like,
the graphs don't really sell the whole story. Like it
just probably feels bad.
It provides a sharp contrast, but you gotta kind of play it to understand like how it feels because execute drains your rage bar basically every time you're pressing it, and then like you're just hoping that your next auto comes before the GCD. Otherwise, you're standing there with your dick in your hand because you can't press anything. You do get extra overpower procs, and that helps, but it's very, very jarring, especially going from a really good rage economy before that. At any rate, I expect they'll fix that, and once they do, if they make it similar to the rest of the rage economy, you won't care so much for not having those sudden death procs.
Yeah. Now, I guess, move on to...
I will say one more thing. Actually, on the subject of Slayer, one glaring flaw, Slayer really doesn't have much defensive benefit.
True. That is very true, because you have the Demolish active. They did nerf it, so it's not 5% anymore. It's back to 2.5%, which is still very good. Arms does have the avoidance, the Seasoned Soldier avoidance, which is decent, but depending on the situation, either does a lot or nothing. But
Colossus gets a surprising amount of damage reduction because it's now 2.5 less damage, which isn't amazing, but it's better than nothing. I mean, that's nothing to sneer at when it's just all the time. It also has 15% increased ignore pain, which is kind of huge, really, especially if you have the extra rage to use it. The other talent, the recently renamed Veterans Vitality, is kind of iffy. I don't think it's that amazing. It's nice, but it's not that great. I think the increased ignore pain is really good though. And then one part that's overlooked by a lot of people is the last node, Dominus of the Colossus. When you use Demolish on something, it leaves a residual debuff that increases the damage they take and reduces the damage they deal to you by 5% for 10 seconds. And since you're using Demolish like every 30-ish seconds, that's actually got pretty good uptime. So it's an extra, usually 5% damage you're not taking. So the Colossus actually has a good amount of defensive benefits, whereas you go to Slayer and you heal for 15% of the damage done by sudden death. Like, that's not that great.
Death drive is horrendous.
Yes. Sorry, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah. So sudden death just doesn't proc anywhere near enough. Like for this to even be remotely good, it just doesn't. A lot of people, when Slayer was first being talked about and being packaged as a hero spec for execute enjoyers, everyone immediately thought Condemn. And I know you've touched on this as well, Archie, but the shield from Condemn, just add it. Like it was brilliant.
That would be
Macria with Remornia Condemn cleaving. So good, dude.
Yeah, that's my favorite solution. As Dan said, the heal, you just don't get sudden death enough for a 15% heal to matter. It was previously 50%, and that actually would have added up to a lot of healing, even though, I would take damage absorption over healing any day. But my favorite change, if I, just had the ability to make the change, all I can do is recommend things, is if they put the Condemn Shield, some form of the Condemn Shield on that, I think that would be a really, really nice defensive benefit. Slayer does still have those kind of auxiliary mobility benefits in Vicious Agility and Relentless Pursuit. So, you get that extra movement speed after charge, which is a bonus I've been asking for since literally like Warlords of Draenor. And you've got the other one that reduces your cooldown of Heroic Leap whenever you charge, and charge when you Heroic Leap. Those are really fun, and they might be kind of defensive in nature, probably more offensive in nature in PvP, but I think Death Drive really needs some significant buffs to make it Slayer compete with, Mountain Thane or Colossus in terms of defensive benefit.
Yeah, because I mean, there's not much else to say on it. It just you say 7.5% DR, and then you see no DR, and you're like, I would like some DR. I would like some DR, please.
If they want to handicap the Condemn Shield, just make it absorb magic damage only. Like that I think would be. I honestly think that would be fine. Like, there's never really an abundance of AoE physical damage, but even then, Warrior innately has reinforced plates, for example. So if they wanted to try and kneecap it a little bit, obviously mess around with the values as well. But yeah, that would be an idea.
All right. Well, I think it's time to talk about Fury. And do you want to start with Thane or Slayer, since we are already on Slayer? What are you feeling? What's the dice roll here?
I think Slayer for Fury is very similar to Arms. There's not a lot to talk about that isn't already covered with Arms, because it doesn't really do anything interactive with the class. It's mostly just tacked onto the spec. It's just kind of on top of what the spec is already doing. It does work a little cleaner for Fury because you're pressing Bloodthirst on cooldown both in single target and multi-target, so it doesn't have that problem of, do I press Mortal Strike or do I press Cleave? The real main difference for Fury Slayer is that Bladestorm for Fury is shorter than Arms. Where the Arms Bladestorm is
it's 6 seconds non-hasted, right? And then
Fury's 6 seconds times haste, and Fury is 4. And the big, that doesn't sound like a lot of time difference, but when you consider the amount of haste that Fury has, and you consider that Fury is much more likely to run Champion Spear, at least in single target, than they are Thunderous Roar, that really makes a difference, because Bladestorm inside of Champion's Might, for that 25% crit buff, plus you have Recklessness running, so you've got a pretty good crit rate. That actually does a lot of damage. I did not think it would actually be as good as it is. I was still thinking, Bladestorm, more of a multi-target ability. I don't think it would be something like, right now, Arms uses Bladestorm when they get to a single target situation like a boss and Mythic Plus. They use it before they go into all their cooldowns, right? They're really just using it as a vehicle for Hurricane. And then they Colossus Smash, then they do all their stuff just to overlap them. But Fury, at least with Slayer, is dropping that spear, then they're doing Bladestorm, and I mean, it skyrockets. It does a lot of damage. I can show you some graphs so you can throw up on screen.
Because even in single target with wasn't it the new talent where it does 20% more damage, but it spreads out? So you have the already really strong Bladestorm, but then you have that 20% on top of the buffs it's already gotten. That's kind of amplified into like one target.
Ironically, that talent's actually bugged right now. Instead of
multiplying by... isn't bugged. Holy shit.
Instead of multiplying by 1 plus 20%, it's multiplying by 20%, which means it's an 80% damage reduction. Yeah, it's severely bugged right now. But yeah, theoretically, I mean, that Culling Cyclone's kind of set up as you gain more damage if you're hitting one target, which is something Bladestorm's traditionally had a problem with, right? It's a multi-target ability, so if it does a lot of damage on single target, it does too much on multi-target, or, if it does too much on multi-target, it's not going to do well on single target. But that talent is kind of designed to fix that, but we haven't really been able to test it very well. However, Brutal Finish is just better in general. Like, if you actually run the numbers, Brutal Damage adds a lot. It also, interestingly, is better in multi-target, because while Culling Cyclone scales down, it's 20% split evenly across all targets. So if you have one target, you get a 20% damage bonus to Bladestorm. If you have 20 targets, you get a 1% damage against each of them, which is still only 20%.
Yeah.
Brutal Finish just adds 50% damage to your Rampage, and that's for every target it hits. It doesn't scale down in multi-target, so it's actually better in single target and better in multi-target, ironically.
Because that's also stacking with the disgusting talent of Slaughtering Strikes.
Yeah, but again, that's just a tuning issue. Like, they could change 50% to 40% or whatever number works. It's not that important. It is kind of odd that they both do the same thing, kind of, but yeah, Fury Slayer actually pumps out a lot of damage, more so than I really thought it would at first glance. And also, Fury doesn't really have the big problem of talent point economy when it's trying to take Bladestorm. It really just trades Ravager for Bladestorm.
Yeah, I'm still not sure how I feel about Hurricane as a talent. It's very... Like, it's really good, but... Yeah, but it's basically... It's good, but it's just kind of... It's one of the things where, like, well, are you taking this talent? Or you're taking Hurricane. It's not interesting, but it's just good. I don't know. Hurricane just feels... It feels like it's a very weird talent. Especially when all of the competing talents around it don't really seem to even come within a 10-mile radius of strength compared to it.
Yeah, no, I can agree with that. I think the buffs to Bladestorm have kind of helped, though, because previously it always felt like if you were playing Bladestorm, you were going to take Hurricane with it because it was the only thing that really made Bladestorm all that worthwhile. That's kind of why you took it. You took Bladestorm in order to hit Hurricane. Now, at least, it's like, well, we take Bladestorm because it does a lot of damage, and we can throw Hurricane on top of that. Hell yeah, that's even more damage. We love that. Hurricane itself is just inherently flawed. It's way too strong. I don't know how it survived all of Dragonflight like this, but somehow it did. Yeah, still surprised to not see any change to it whatsoever. Surely it can't go into War Within like this as well, but I don't know. We'll see, I guess.
That is a lot of Bladestorm damage that you just sent me.
I'm saying. So the thing about Hurricane is it was designed for a good reason. Just like I was talking about with Culling Cyclone, the reason Hurricane exists is to scale up your damage in a way that works in single target, even if Bladestorm itself is not great in single target. So it's a nice idea, it's just not a particularly satisfying one, because it makes Bladestorm feel like it's just a vehicle for Hurricane, right? It feels like you're using Bladestorm for the buff you get out of it, rather than for its own damage. And as Dan said, the damage increase they did to Bladestorm was substantial, and it does really help that feeling. Like, Bladestorm feels like it stands alone now, even in single target, and with, as I've shown with Fury there. But I still think that Unhinged would do it better. In many ways, it's not actually that different, right? If you're pressing Bladestorm to get a bunch of Mortal Strikes or Rampages or whatever out of Unhinged, you're still not pressing it for the Bladestorm damage itself. You're pressing it for the auxiliary effect. Instead of the Hurricane buff, it's the Mortal Strikes. But I think it feels a lot better when you get that burst of direct damage rather than just another damage window to line up and overlap with all your other damage windows. I think that's more of the problem. And I also just don't really like that gameplay of, like, use Bladestorm and then go into all of your cooldowns. If I'm taking Bladestorm, I want to use Bladestorm as, like, one of the principal parts of my damage.
Yeah, because Slayer feels like it's another one of those desyncing issues where it's, even though you said right now it's bugged, so anger management isn't even providing the correct amount of CDR. You have your avatar, you have your rec, I don't know what kind of trinkets we might have, but Slayer does feel, at least to me, like, just from, like, looking in from the outside, since I haven't, like, touched it myself, desyncing all of your stuff just kind of seems like it's not like it's not really a problem, but people like to sync all their stuff up, right? And especially when I consider something that's not necessarily in Warrior's wheelhouse about, like, augmentation evoker, where that is really about, in terms of min-max and, like, synchronizing everything. We're already desynced from a buff like that because we're a minute and a half compared to their 2-minute setup. But
Okay, I'm just like way off topic at this point.
Paper napkin math.
Yeah,
We can't test it right now.
Yeah,
We can't
no.
test it right now because of the bug. But paper napkin math puts Bladestorm with anger management and with unrelenting onslaught, and anger management's bugged for both specs, by the way. But you should get a very low cooldown on Bladestorm. Like you should be rocking about a 35 second cooldown on Bladestorm with both of those. Now that also depends a little bit on that aforementioned problem with imminent demise. Like, are you getting sudden death procs when you can actually consume Mark for Execution and stuff? But just in general, there's some irony in that you'll actually spend more time channeling as a Slayer than you would as a Colossus, because you press Bladestorm about as often as you press Demolish, and Bladestorm lasts longer. But with that low of a cooldown, I'm not sure how big of a problem overlap will be. That's something that we'll really have to test and just find out. But yeah, it is a little awkward, and it's definitely giving you a lot of things to keep track of for both specs, because anger management alone would make Bladestorm or Ravager line up perfectly with Recklessness, but having anger management and unrelenting onslaught suddenly makes it a lot less. So how that lines up will remain to be seen. It also actually, because it's bugged right now, Fury can play very competently with Reckless Abandon, at least in single target. And it's kind of interesting, and it gives Fury a little bit of flavor as a Slayer that you don't get as a Thane, because you can kind of have a little bit of a different rotation there. But once they fix the bug with anger management, I would not be surprised if that's better even in single target for Slayer. But that remains to be seen. We'll see. Have to wait and see how that shakes out.
Yeah.
I do like it, though. It's kind of weird because you only get one charge of Reckless Abandon now when you cast Rampage, so you have to choose whether you're consuming it with Bloodthirst or Radiant Blow. And you want to consume it with Bloodthirst, but because of that, it's kind of awkward because you don't have Annihilator anymore. You don't have that one GCD cooldown on Bloodthirst. You always have two GCDs between it. So if you're playing Reckless Abandon as a Slayer, you really have to think about tempo and timing. And because if you were to, for example, press Bloodthirst and then press Rampage and get your Reckless Abandon stack, you can't press Bloodthirst again for a GCD. So if you press Rampage or Raging Blow there, you're consuming your stack on a weaker ability, and you don't want to do that. So you really got to think about when you're pressing Rampage so that you can consume that buff with the proper ability. And it's a little weird at times, but it's kind of fun to give you something to focus on that's different than what Thane does. Because one of the biggest problems with hero talents is just that despite all the bonuses from the talents themselves, the core specs talent and play fairly similar to one another. Like Arms is almost identical, Fury is only a few differences. So I like it.
Yeah, and I guess with the potential, like if there is a potential for that Reckless Abandon play style, the new Blood Craze does feed into that very well, where if you're hitting that Raging Blow to give your Bloodthirst more crit, which obviously is also buffing your Bloodbath, that is an interesting, I wouldn't say like setup style of gameplay, because it's not, but it adds more flavor to the Slayer being you're hitting the Bloodthirst button, right? Because it's like, yeah you want to hit this button now because it does this, because it's percent based, because you're getting all of these different buffs to it. And Reckless Abandon does also solve, not necessarily solve, but it helps that issue of your Avatar, Wreck, and Bladestorm just desyncing from each other in like a potential weird manner. But
plus
overall,
you get that fierce follow through,
yeah,
increasing the it's Bloodthirst crits increase the damage in next Bloodthirst, and that also plays into what you're talking about with the Blood Craze and everything else. I will say it's not as game changing as the Season 2 bonus, and that's where the inspiration for the Blood Craze change came from, right? Because the Season 2 Fury bonus plays the same way, but the difference is you're not holding on to Bloodthirst until you get 100% crit, so you're not going to have that ka-ching weak aura playstyle, which is good or bad depending on how much you like it. Blood Craze is very passive. You're never going to build up to a guaranteed Bloodthirst, but you will consistently have a higher crit rate on your Bloodthirst, and that does have residual benefits from like fierce follow through. And if you set that up with a juicy, bloodbath, it actually does feel very impactful. You can actually see it in that graph that I showed you. You've got a pretty beefy bloodbath there to hit for 106k, and of course this is without raid buffs or good gear or anything like that. I mean, it hit. That was a pretty juicy crit right there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it did a third of an entire Blade Storm, so like that's pretty good. But I guess moving away from Slayer to okay. So initially, Mountain Thane and its thematics and how it works and how it looks, and you're hitting big T claps and you're doing big damage, you have these thunder strikes. Thane, I think, is the obvious winner in terms of like thematics and visuals of all of these hero talents and specs for Warrior. But Thane is the staple problem child of the talent point tax when we're looking into what they need, what they can take, what they can get. I mean, you're even looking at stuff like potentially Meat Cleaver on single target just because it's buffing that. I don't know. Obviously, the numbers would decide what's better to take Meat Cleaver or something else. But while Thane seems the coolest, and it seems like it can probably do a bunch of good damage in AoE, it seems a lot about it is just kind of feels problematic outside of its visuals, just because you have procs on procs. Are you getting an avatar proc here? Is your lightning strike sitting here? Is this doing this? It feels, I don't have the correct word for it.
I do.
What's the word? There you go.
Chaotic. It is chaos personified. Mountain Thane is kind of everything that Colossus isn't, I think is the best way to describe it. When we first look at Mountain Thane, a lot of people thought, okay, this is a really strong theme, but it's kind of boring. It's just kind of a bunch of random procs, and it's not affecting the way you play. And there was even a problem for a while where I had done the math, and it wasn't even worth casting Bloodthirst. So Thane has two primary effects. Pressing Raging Blow, Execute, Thunderclap, all procs Lightning Strikes. Pressing Bloodthirst procs a Thunderous Blast, which is an upgraded version of Thunderclap. And the math previously did not support actually pressing Bloodthirst. You literally just spammed Raging Blow, because getting extra Lightning Strikes was worth more than getting that Thunder Blast upgrade. They have since changed that, both by buffing Bloodthirst and the Lightning Strike proc rates, and the introduction of Flashing Skies as a talent point just dramatically changed that. Now you're pressing Bloodthirst on cooldown, and because of that, you're getting a lot of those Thunder Blast procs, while still also getting Lightning Strikes out of Flashing Skies. So it's very chaotic in that you have a lot of procs going on. On the surface, you're just pressing Bloodthirst every 3 GCDs, the same way Slayer is. You're pressing Execute when it procs. You're pressing Raging Blow is just a glorified filler now. But you get a bunch of Thunderblast procs. You get a lot of Lightning Strikes, which give you a lot of extra rage, which gives you more Rampage to use. You don't have that Reckless Abandon, like, when do I want to use this so I can get Bloodbath? But with Anger Management, you're also getting a lot of Ravager and Recklessness, and Recklessness procs Avatar, and when you have Avatar up, you're getting even more Lightning Strikes, which gives you even more rage. It's just got a lot of little things that are all playing together, which, again, it's the exact opposite of Colossus. Colossus does one thing. It just presses Demolish, and it does it well. Mountain Thane does, like, 5 different things, and they're all little individually, but they all add up to a very, like, it does feel kind of like Unleashed Lightning.
Yeah, which I think goes pretty well with its thematics. The one thing I was personally concerned with Mountain Thane, which is something they can fix with tuning, is the want to press Thunderclap on single target, right? Where it's just, they're gonna make the button, like, tuning wise, they're gonna make the button, you're gonna want to press it because they want you to press it, right? But it just feels weird on having a very AoE centric button that you're just going to be pressing on single target. I mean, I do think their solution of, hey, you're just taking Whirlwind off your bar and putting Thunderclap here to be a fine one in terms of like swapping that around. Because if it was one of those styles of gameplay where it's, oh, well, you need to Whirlwind this global and then Thunderblast it, that would suck. But they've already nipped that in the bud with all the bonuses being attributed to Thunderclap as well. But how are you feeling about Thane, Mr. Dan? What's your experience been?
I like it a lot. Like from the very beginning, it's always been the hero spec that I've preferred the most on many levels. Granted, as the alpha cycle's gone on and as we head into beta, the gap between all three of them has become a lot closer. It used to be like Thane, then Colossus quite close to it, and then Slayer way down below, but that was mostly due to bugs. Now, definitely a lot closer. There's two things in particular that I feel about Thane. Evidently, the direction of it, at least from what I can tell, is to try and capture some of that Fury Storm of Swords style gameplay at a time where we won't have Storm of Swords. Having having Thunderclap instead of Whirlwind and having a cooldown on it basically is just the same. It gives you that window where this button's doing more damage, and now you've got a window before you can use the next one. So now you can get all these other abilities in, and that's fine, I guess. I don't think they went hard enough on the Storm Strike damage, and I've been mentioning this for a while because I still don't think they've gone hard enough on the Storm Strike damage. I don't like that we have the Call of Thunder hero talent increasing the damage of Storm Strike and nature damage when the only two things that cause it are lightning strikes, which granted now are a bigger proportion of your damage because there's a lot more of them, and Thunderblast. And those are the only two things. And I feel like there was definitely room for them to add a bit more. Previous ideas that I've had have been either like your next rampage after Thunderblast, for example, could be Storm Strike damage instead, or X number of abilities after pressing Avatar, which would also cover the Avatar proc from the Avatar of the Storm capstone talent. Just something like that, just to try and push that a little bit more, because it feels like a lost opportunity. Because it's really cool. I like the idea of having a certain style of warrior that doesn't just do pure physical damage, because let's be honest, in this day and age, that's just a joke. Every other class has some meaningful form of magic damage, and it's beginning to look a bit grim that we're kind of one of the only ones that is still pure physical. One of the first buffs slash debuffs in a raid comp that you look to lose if you have to is the monk debuff, and that impacts warrior hugely. So pushing that a little bit more would have helped that a little bit, but that's a very, very niche situation. But overall, I really like the hero spec. Like you say, the thematics of it are really cool. I kind of like how it plays. I don't mind that it's also looking to be Bloodthirst centric now, for the record. Like I've said for ages that with them giving the forcibly longer Bloodthirst cooldown without having the old Deft experience, I feel like that is the healthier way to have Fury play out. So you've got Bloodthirst on CD, but you're still using Raging Blow and fillers in between because you have a meaningful gap there where you just can't do anything else. So I don't mind that both hero specs will go this way, because all in all, I do think it is the healthiest way. You can just have it vary up with what you do in between those moments. So, again, Thunderblast procs with Mountain Thane and Blade Storm with Slayer. So overall, yeah, I like it a lot. I really do.
I think my major point of feedback was that I really wanted the two hero specs to have distinct gameplay styles. So early on, in the very beginning of the alpha, I really liked the idea of Slayer being Bloodthirst focused, and you use Raging Blow kind of as a filler, and then Mountain Thane would use Raging Blow mainly and use Bloodthirst only intermittently. I was very attached to the idea of like a Season 2 style gameplay where you would build up a crit with Blood Craze, use Bloodthirst at 100%, your little ka-ching moment, and like auto proc a Thunderous Blast and all that. I think the idea was very solid and still would work really well. However, with the updates they've made to Thane and Slayer both, and even the base spec, I think the gameplay now is very solid. I still think there may be a problem, maybe not in the first season or even the second season, depending on what tier sets do. But by the end of the War Within, if we haven't seen more adjustment, I think there will be some fatigue where, like, okay, I'm kind of tired of every build playing more or less the same way. But at least for now, that's not a problem. That can be tomorrow's problem. The core gameplay right now is very satisfying, and there is a little bit of difference, especially if Slayer does end up leaning into Reckless Abandon more. There is a little bit of difference between, are you pressing Thunderblast, which procs quite a bit actually. Plus, you have Burst of Power, which gives you that Bloodthirst. You get 3 Bloodthirsts in a row, kind of thing. There are at least subtle differences, even if they're not massive, like completely new rotations. So I think both are fun. Where they'll end up long term kind of depends on like what happens once that honeymoon phase is over. But I do enjoy playing both right now.
I think one issue that I had, I don't know if you've had any different experiences, Archie, but one of the issues I had was with a more Bloodthirst-centric playstyle, because they have openly said that they want us using Thunderblast basically whenever it procs. If you're going with, so say, what's the best way to give this as an example? Say you get a Burst of Power proc after a Lightning Strike. You've come out of a Rampage, you've basically got no Rage, but now you've got 2 Bloodthirsts that you want to use back-to-back. You use both of those, both of them proc a Thunderblast, and then you use both of those Thunderblasts. You've gone through 4 globals on low Rage, with abilities that also grant you low Rage, so you can't then get to your next Rampage, and then suddenly you're out of Enrage. I don't know if you've come across this situation at all, but I came across it a few times previously, and it just feels pretty awful, because you're just forcibly dropping Enrage.
A little bit. I think mainly the change to... So they changed one of the talents on the tree. It's called Flashing Skies. It's in the lower left-hand corner, where every time you cast Thunderblast, it automatically triggers a Lightning Strike. And Thunderclap and Thunderblast already had a chance to. It was the same base chance that Raging Blow and Execute have, which I want to say now is like 25 up to 32% with the extra increased talent. But now it's all the time when you press Thunderblast. And that actually does a lot to, A, reinforce the value of pressing Thunderblast when it procs, but also, B, there's another talent, Gathering Clouds, I think it's called, where whenever you get a Lightning Strike, you generate 5 Rage. And the two of those combined, you're getting a lot of Rage when you're using those, all the things. When you're pressing Bloodthirst, you get a bunch. When you're pressing Thunderblast, they increase that amount, so it's generating 10 Rage instead of 5 now. So I have not had a problem with maintaining Enrage. It does fall off occasionally, but it always comes up very quickly after. I think on a single target test, I usually have about 96% uptime, which is, very high, especially for relatively low gear where we're at right now. And that's playing with the haste talent. If for some reason we end up playing with the powerful Enrage talent, that might change a little bit because you get an extra second on your rage time, but you also have a lot less haste to get it up faster. At any rate, what you're describing is very chaotic, though, and there is definitely a problem in Thane where you have that conflicting priorities. I don't always know what to press because I have Thunderblast, but then I also just got a proc a Burst of Power, so now I can press Bloodthirst 3 times, but now I have enough Rage for Rampage, and now I got a Sudden Death proc, and I don't know what to do. It's kind of a problem, but it's also kind of fun. Like, it's overwhelming, but I think once you spend a little time playing it and get used to it, it becomes kind of a fun moment where you're just like, I want to do all the things.
They should make the last hit of Rampage activate one of your Thunderblast charges. I think I'd be sick. Because imagine that, like, you hit the Rampage, you hit the last hit, and then you get the Thunderblast and the Lightning Strikes. It'd be sick.
There is another talent. It's the one that's on the choice node with Flashing Skies. I don't remember the name of it now, but whenever you cast
Induction.
There you go. Whenever you cast Recklessness, it triggers a charge of Thunderblast. And I really like that concept because it gives you that kind of go power when like you're pulling a new pack and you've got anger management, so you have rec for like every pack, and you press it and you just immediately get start with a Thunderblast. It feels like a lot of power. It is unfortunately not that good of a talent because you automatically get 2 charges, which is the max of Thunderblast whenever you press Avatar, and obviously overlapping those wastes one. But it is kind of what you're talking about, where like you can choose a go time where you just press your cooldown and you get Thunderblast and you hit something hard. I think the only real problem actually is in AoE. It's kind of awkward having Thunderclap / Blast as your AoE enabler and your big damage button, because what happens is on a normal opener when we're playing on live, for example, you'll like throw your cooldowns, charge, whirlwind, and then rampage or whatever. And you don't really care that the whirlwind wasn't enraged because it doesn't do a lot of damage anyway. Thunder Blast does a lot of damage, especially in AoE. It's like 25% of my damage in AoE. This is not the paltry 5% of your damage whirlwind's just there to enable other things. Like Thunder Blast puts out. And so you really want to make sure that you're enraged before that happens, whether you hold on to your cooldowns until you've used like Onslaught or something, or whatever. The cooldown's also kind of weird. I've gone back and forth on whether I think it should be lowered or not, because it's a 6-second cooldown, which is fine. It does put a cooldown on your multi-target enabler, which is something people did not like about Storm of Swords in the Annihilator builds, because they couldn't just spam Whirlwind. However, it is a shorter cooldown than Storm of Swords was. You can basically use Thunderclap / Blast every 3 cleaved GCDs instead of every 4, so you're never going to have a problem of like, I can't cleave my Rampage or whatever here. However, its cooldown is a little funky because it shares with Thunderclap, so you get a Thunder Blast and you want to use it even though you already have like 3 charges of your cleave up. So it's a little weird in that it's very different. Yeah, in some ways I think it should be lowered because there is sometimes an oddity where like you press Bloodthirst and you get a Thunder Blast charge, but it's still on cooldown from when I use Thunderclap, so I gotta wait until I can use that button that just lit up. But it kind of goes back into that chaos, and that Thane really does feel like Unleashed Lightning, and I feel like that kind of plays well into that theme, and it makes it feel, even though you don't have as much control as you necessarily want, it makes it feel really exciting to play.
It feels like there's quite a nice element of dynamicism
in
this spec, and I like it a lot.
But it's fun.
Yeah, I like it a lot.
Do you think people are going to do the I don't know if it's going to work the same, but with the Annihilator build setup, you know how people were putting Rampage and Bloodbath in the same macro? Do you think they're going to be doing that with Thunderblast because it's a modifier, kind of like how the Bloodbath is a modifier? So just so they're like not missing procs or anything? But I mean, I guess the cooldown makes it so it's like that's not really going to happen.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it actually works the same way for. So the reason that works for live is actually a bug that's a feature. It's because you don't know, like you do not have Bloodbath as a learned spell until Reckless Abandon procs, and that's why it will skip the normal macro order of like, if you just tried to macro Slam and Whirlwind, it would only ever try to cast Slam because you know both spells, and it will never try to cast the second one. That's just
interesting.
On GC's work. Yeah, the reason that works is because your character, like, internally does not know Bloodbath as a spell until you've gotten Reckless Abandon, and then it learns it and can use it, and that's why it gets around that restriction. And when you don't have the buff, it'll default to Rampage. I don't know, actually, offhand, if Thane works the same way. I think it probably does, but the cooldown will prevent that from being a thing anyway, so it shouldn't really matter.
Yeah, I don't know. It just popped in my head just because I don't know why I was thinking about it, but I was like, it might
it might.
But
it might, but again, I think the cooldown keeps that from being a problem. Because you're definitely not spamming it.
Yeah. Well, let's see here. Because I think you said you've got a meeting in about 20 minutes. So, is there anything else we want to chunk? Actually, one thing I am curious on your guys' thoughts about it is it's not warrior specific. I'm not the biggest fan of the embellishment system. I think it's okay. I think one thing they could do to make it that I would like it a little more, just because I'm dumb and I like item level, is if they made the embellished pieces just those couple item levels higher, so they're matching like your mythic gear in terms of quality. But how do you feel about the embellishment system for this expansion?
I don't really have a super strong thought on it either way, I'll be honest. It's just been like, because none of the embellishments, I guess apart from Blue Silken Lining right now, which is kind of immense, I don't think any of them have really been that overly impactful. They all seem to have had a fairly minor effect.
Yeah, most
I
of them are
would,
just like passive.
yeah, like they're not. None of them. I mean, yeah, none of them are all that interesting. But I guess that was never the point. I mean, I guess the point was just to make the crafting system a little bit more entertaining as well, more than anything. I feel like it just goes into a bigger problem with the crafting system as a whole, rather than embellishments themselves. They can't seem to settle on how strong they want to make the crafting system, which is a nice roulette wheel to spin every single patch. But embellishments themselves are mostly non-offensive. They can keep them, they could get rid of them, they could condense them into one and make them stronger. That would also be fine. Or you could have it not be on crafted items and just allow an embellishment type effect to be added to any piece of gear if you really wanted to go that route. But it's mostly non-offensive, and I'm sure they'll just keep iterating on it until they finally settle on something.
I know we've data mined a few of the embellishments, but for the life of me, I can't remember any of them off the top of my head. I mostly don't care.
Yeah, it's kind of something you plug into the robot, but it feels weird.
Yeah, and like Dan said, they're mostly passive. I mean, Blue Silken is kind of the outlier, and only because it's so strong. But most of them are just kind of boring. They're kind of passive, a low amount of passive damage that you it's a check mark, right? It's just like checking the box on anything else, Do I have Battle Shout? Yes. Do I have my embellishments? Okay. Um, on the flip side, though, I think if you make them too unique, that might detract from everything else that you're doing. If we were over there trying to what's the embellishment that for PvP that it's the boots, right?
Well, there's
War boots of impunity, I think they're called.
Well, there's two of them. There's the one that where you interrupt, you get a damage buff, and there's the one that the newer one that they added is if
you CC, right?
No, it's if you miss an interrupt, like if you actually someone interrupts you, hits you with a kick, and you're not casting, you get hard cast, you just get immunity from interrupts and stuff for 4 seconds.
Well, I was thinking of the earlier one, where you interrupt, or I think it procced off charge as well. If you make that the best one, it's kind of like the Sephu's ring from Legion, right? If you make that the best one, then suddenly we're playing around it all the time. And I think that may be an even bigger problem than just having a boring Shadow Flame embellishment, right? Yeah. So I think there are two sides of the coin. I think the current version of embellishments, maybe Blue Silken notwithstanding, is probably the least offensive to everyone. Because it's just there, it's an extra little power spike, it makes crafting more important, but I don't really have to dedicate a whole lot of thought to it. I think my main wish is that embellishments were a little more varied between players and classes, and it wasn't just like everybody is running Blue Silken, or, I don't know if all the other play classes value Vercerus quite as much as we do. I think because they're also all using Blue Silken. But in Season 2, it was everybody using Shadow Flame. I think that's they're like trinkets in that it's kind of boring when everybody uses the
Yeah,
same
because
thing.
everybody was about to use like a undulating spore cloak before they
Yeah,
nerfed
or
it
that.
again.
And the Spore Cloak's fun. I mean, I think it's a good
I
effect,
like the cloak
obviously.
actually.
Honestly, at this point, it kind of goes back to Legion legendaries, to Shadowlands legendaries, and even Heart of Azeroth, Azerite traits. At this point, I find a lot of the damage effects to be boring no matter what they do. It's just a little bit of extra damage. I actually get more excited these days about defensive benefits. Like, I had Safuz as, or I'm sorry, Prydas as my very first Legion legendary, and I hated it because it was, so much worse than the Execute Ring or whatever the other good ones were. And I did not get a DPS legendary until we killed Gul'dan, I think, in Nighthold, and I was like, oh, I'm so behind. But they buffed up Prydas a few times over the course, but I gotta say, like, it actually affected my gameplay a lot more than having a DPS legendary would have, because I was like, wow, I'm tanky, I can survive goddamn anything. And everybody else is complaining about this does too much damage, and I go run out for the smash or whatever, and I'm just like, da 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 da, just press my buttons because I could tank anything with that big ass Pride Ash shield. So at this point, I actually get more excited for those. So I don't know. They already have a lot of defensive creep in Dragonflight and probably the War Within, so maybe moving embellishments to more defensive oriented would not be a great call, but I would not I would probably find more excitement in that than just you get even more damage.
Yeah, I do
I do
think.
find it.
Yeah, go ahead.
I do find it incredible. Your point about the whole defensive creep thing is actually something I wanted to touch on earlier when we were talking about the whole like defensive talents and comparing things like reinforced plates to veteran of the Third War and that paladin one's called,
Sanctified.
which is just so that one which is just dumb as hell. I find it amazing that they're actually just making that problem worse steadily when healers are floundering for something to do and to not have their entire role be completely irrelevant because everyone just keeps themselves alive instead. How that's becoming steadily worse is beyond me, and I feel like they're kind of missing the mark on that one a bit. It's
Yeah.
There's a
quite
really
weak.
good Thune video, and I know you're a Cataclysm enjoyer right now, probably. Um, but Thune had the video of like comparing, I think it was actually Cataclysm to Dragonflight in terms of like how much damage we're taking, and just how health bars used to actually just not be either 100 or 0 all the time. Like you actually could be at like 40-50% and be like, oh shit, gotta do something about this. Um, and I do think that a lot of the defensives and absorbs, and I mean I like listening to the Potty C or whatever with like Dratnos, Dorky, and Maximum, and every week they talk about defensives and the problems with it. And even when you're looking at higher keys right now, you see, oh, well, there's just keys being done technically without a healer, but that's because everyone has so much stuff that the healer just zones in as DPS until they don't have that
Yeah.
stuff, and then they come back in as a healer to have stuff when they don't have anything anymore. It's a very weird situation.
Yeah, I don't know how they take a step more towards the Cataclysm style of how health bars sort of played out, I guess. Because you're right, I am absolutely a Cataclysm enjoyer at the moment. I've been having a lot of fun, so much fun. I even have a Holy Paladin alt, so I've been
Ooh.
experiencing it firsthand, and yeah, it feels nice to look at a health bar and realize there's a certain threshold you can get it to where said player will not die, but that doesn't mean they have to be topped before the next ability. You've got time to sort of finesse it and play around with it, and you know that they don't have as many tools as they do on retail right now in order to help themselves survive. Like, yeah, the number of tools is cut down drastically, and it's nice. I don't know how much work they would have to do in order to get back to something like that. I think they're kind of in too deep at this point. There would have to be some major kind of overhaul. And ultimately, they'll probably just do what they always do, and that's increase health bars by a ton and increase damage by a ton, and then try and meet it somewhere in the middle. And they've done that on several occasions, and every time they just lose it again because the power creep is inevitable.
Yeah, the shoot, what was I gonna say? It was literally on the tip of my tongue. Now it's gone.
Warrior brain.
Oh no. It was gonna be, speaking of like cooldowns. Rally needs help. Help Rally. Rally got put in the dumpster and left there.
To be fair, Rally was already in the dumpster in like small group content. I don't think Rally. I don't know. I know it was a very memed on and controversial take, but I think the Rally change was fine. It literally just gave us an extra talent point and didn't even nerf Rally as much as people thought.
Yeah,
So,
well, I think Rally is still, it's still like a decent button. I mainly mention it because I do like doing a lot of Mythic Plus, or a decent amount. I've actually been playing a ton of Remix actually recently.
It definitely needs help in Mythic Plus, whether that's a talent switch and we get something else that's Rally-like and maybe better suited for 5 targets, or whether it's a Augvoker, and I think Darkness has a similar effect on it now too, does it not? That makes it better when it only affects a certain number of players. Something to that degree, I think, would be fine.
Yeah,
they're doing a bunch of healing throughput cooldown changes to that effect as well, which is good to see.
Well, I think the overall changes, I think, was to try and figure out what's going on with the healing, which is why they're like nerfing Rally. A while back they nerfed a lot of these big AoE raid wide cooldowns.
They nerfed all of them, and that's why Rally also got hit.
Yeah, because that's fine. Yeah, so that's fine because they're trying to figure out like, well, because basically nothing mattered around outside of hitting these big like 3 to 4 minute buttons in these certain intervals. So I think they're trying. A lot of those nerfs were like trying to fix that. But yeah, Darkness goes from 15 to 30% in 5-man content. I think Rally could just use the double treatment for that. It obviously still wouldn't help Warriors' lack of utility in some of those things and against affixes, but that's like a whole nother Mythic Plus thing.
Yeah.
But I guess sorry, go ahead.
I was just say I don't really get into the healer discussion so much because I kind of try to make it a habit not to talk about things I'm not well versed in, and I don't play a healer. I don't really care about healing. I just want to hit things. So I'm certainly not an expert on that subject. However, I can't blame Blizzard for trying to fix things. Yeah. They may not always do it the right way, and I'm sure there were better ideas, and there are still better ideas than what they have tried, but I can't blame them for at least trying to do something to fix it. Especially when, like, we're sitting here complaining that, we don't get enough changes, or that, like, oh, there's another blue post upcoming tuning and Warrior isn't in them. Don't they know our problems and stuff? Like, I can't blame them when they actually do try to fix something. So I know it's at least on their radar. I do hope they can do something for Rally, because, there are times where I just feel like maybe I just dropped this talent entirely, But, yeah. I will say I do like how Fury feels from a tanky perspective.
Oh,
like,
Fury,
a
you
tanky standpoint.
feel unkillable as Fury.
Even Arms feels good. It's obviously not as good as Fury, but even Arms does feel pretty good a lot of times.
I do feel like Fury is just too far, and I think Arms is in maybe not the perfect spot right now. I do think it's a lot tankier than people give it credit for. It's just you have to actively press things in order to be tanky, and that's good. Being as passively tanky as now Ret Paladin and also Fury Warrior are is just inherently not so good for the game. Might be good for an individual player, which is fair enough, but I like having to be aware of the damage that's coming in and what I have to press in order to survive it. It's like Windwalker Monk, they're exactly the same. Tanky as hell, but that's because they've got a lot of tools. Mage as well. That's only because they have a lot of tools in order to live, and it's up to you how you plan those out. And if you do it correctly, you're effectively immortal. I don't mind that too much at all, but Fury's definitely one step too far.
That's why I really like things like Spell Reflect. Spell Reflect is still, in my opinion, the single greatest improvement they made in Shadowlands, and then, of course, they improved it further in Dragonflight. I just absolutely love what that ability did to the survivability and the feeling of Warrior. Defensive Stance 2 is very underrated for how powerful it can be.
Yeah, you just get 30% DR whenever you want it. Like, just D-Stance Spell Reflect. Woo.
Yeah, especially combined with Spell Reflect or whatever you happen to use at the time. It gets a bad rap because it is reduced damage, and I don't know, maybe they could reduce the cooldown from 3 seconds to 2 seconds, or I think if you make it too low, you just get into that constant dancing problem that you have in like Cataclysm and Cataclysm I think is also 3 seconds. It was mostly Mop. I think it was 1.5 second cooldown, and that was probably too much. But I think Defensive Stances is very underrated for how useful it is in terms of that preemptive survivability. And if you use it intelligently, even as arms, you can be practically immortal, barring, standing in one shot. I tell you, we were talking about defensive. Mountain Thane recently had a very, very big glow up on its defensive talents.
Didn't it go from like 4 to 8% or something?
I'm not exactly sure the context of the 4 to 8%, but they buffed. So keep your feet on the ground as a first down. It's a choice node. It gave you a damage reduction when you use Thunderblast, and maybe that's it. I think it was 3 or 4 or 5% before, and now it's 8% for 5 seconds.
Yeah, I think that was 4%, and it was in the bottom left of the tree before.
And that talent kind of sucked before because we weren't actively caring about Thunderblast, right? Well, at least in singles target. Multi-target still used it, but we weren't actively caring about that. But now that you're pressing Bloodthirst on cooldown, you're getting a lot of Thunderblast procs. So you're getting that extra 8% DR. It only lasts 5 seconds, but you're getting it like every 8 to 10 seconds, maybe a little more. So you've still got, I can check, but I think I was getting like 50, 60% uptime on it.
It also gives us 8% armor, which leads into
and armor. Too. Yep. It's like 1% more damage, which is not insignificant for basically free talent. But you combine that with Warpaint, you talk about Fury's passive tankiness. It's not up all the time, but that is a good deal of DR. It's not actually additive, but 15 and 8, basically 23% DR is a lot. The other talent, though, Steadfast, got a 5% stamina increase, and they also changed the way the Victory Rush mechanics work a little bit, which I really like because it allows you to use Victory Rush preemptively to increase your survivability, which I think is a really interesting tactical change.
Yeah, that's definitely underrated because, like, you think about, like, even if I think about like a Mythic Plus scenario, increasing your max health by 10% while also having a 5% stamina node on top of that, and then you can just destance whenever, or you have spell. That's a lot of effective health or whatever you want, and it heals you after the damage effect if you time it correctly too. So like it is juicy.
The healing after the effect is really, I don't want to say underrated because I don't think anybody's really looked at it enough to rate it yet, but it's very surprisingly powerful, and it makes you actually not mind using Impending Victory Rush early, which I think is very interesting as a concept. I think it was Silmarian brought it up in Discord, because I had previously as well kind of disregarded Steadfast in favor of the armor and DR one, but yeah, I mean, he was right. I mean, just getting an extra 10% increased health on top of your baseline 5% increased stamina, that's a lot of effective health, as you say, and I mean that can really help you survive some big hits.
That's awesome.
So I think Thane and Colossus both look really good from a tank perspective, or from a tankiness perspective. I think for tanks specifically, I think Colossus is still a little bit better because of the extra ignore pain, but for Arms and Fury, I mean, they both have a very defensive option there. I think Slayer, again, is very much the odd man out. And I don't know if that's because it looks to be the favorite in PvP and they don't want to make it that good in PvP and tanky, but I hope they do a little something to make Slayer, again, with respect to defensive creep, I hope they do something to make Slayer a little bit closer to the others.
Well, I don't think we're necessarily at that level of defensive creep that's been a big concern. I think most of the main concerns are looking at like mages and aug evokers and stuff. Where mage has like
I think we would be lying to ourselves if we said that Fury wasn't in that wheelhouse.
Oh,
I think Fury right now is easily like the second tankiest spec and class in the entire game.
I think it's crazy.
Ridiculous.
It's just because it's not doing as much AoE damage, it's not on the radar.
Yeah, more or less.
I mean, statistically, it's not really the highest, but it is definitely good. It kind of depends. It kind of varies on, what boss or what raid or whatever we're looking at. Arms Warrior is definitely the worst. I mean, statistically, Arms Warrior is the least survivable, usually tied with like a Hunter and Balance Druid or something. But Fury Warrior is more middle of the pack. It's usually the really survivable ones are like mages, rogues, ret paladins. I think Augmentation Evoker, of course, is really high up there as well. So I don't know. I do think that Fury is probably a little high, especially in relation to Arms, but I'm not sure Fury is the major outlier of classes. I do think it's just a major outlier when you're looking at warriors.
Yeah.
But again, this is not my area of expertise, so I don't really get too deep into the discussion. I know it is a problem, and so I would not really get upset if they did throttle back on it a little bit, as long as they focus on the more passive things. I think, just personally, it's things like passive cheat deaths and immunities, and even to a degree, Fury's passive DR that is more of a problem than active things that you need to think about, like Spell Reflect or Defensive Stance. The way I generally talk about it is I liken it to like Tendril is a good example. If I make a mistake on Tendril or Fire Act, Tendril like the Fire Beam, if I make a mistake and get clipped by the Fire Beam, I die. Maybe I survive if I pop everything first, but that is preemptive. I have to like consciously notice this is going to happen and make the decision to dedicate all of my defensives to it, and that has an effect later down the road where I can't use my defensives to like stand in fire to to take my orb to fly up. Right? I'm losing something there. With a rogue or somebody, they can, if they clip fire, they're cheat death procs. And they just keep doing what they're doing. They didn't have to think about it. They might suffer a little bit later on where they don't have that cheat death for something dangerous later, but like they get to make a mistake and live through it. We don't get that, that leniency. We have to dedicate to survive it.
I'd say that's almost an entirely different discussion. I don't believe that cheat death has any place on non-tanks. Like,
fair. It's getting tangential.
Get it off them.
Yeah, I do think that is the real defensive ramp, is a lot of cheat death and immunities, and just, we had that problem. You remember Legion, right? Tomb of Socaris and stuff. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, is there anything else? I mean, it seems like it's just about time for your meeting, I think, right? I don't want to. Is there anything else you guys want to bring up, or are we feeling good? It was a good yap.
Remove spear, put in blood of the enemy. Same functionality. Just no piss on the floor. Like that's all.
I could talk about spear versus roar and stuff forever, so I won't. I'll spare y'all. But I think there's a way to. I think there's a way to salvage spear. They just need to really commit to it. I don't know. I'm excited. I'm excited for this. I think warrior talents have not had the glow up that other classes have, and that is disappointing, and there is a lack of excitement there. But I think that the play styles are generally fun with the hero talents. I can't compare them to every other class because you all know I really only give a shit about warrior. But I think it's a lot of fun. All four of them are fairly fun to play, and while all four have some problems to fix, whether it's talent tax or the talent pathing or whatever, I think that they're all really fun, and I'm really excited to see what happens when other people like yourself get a chance to put hands on and kind of identify what the good and bad are.
Yeah, because the way I look at it is, like, if all the classes and specs are at a dinner table, right? Some classes and specs currently have a plate made of literal 24 karat gold. But that doesn't mean we're still not eating good. Like, I think we have received a lot of good changes, and there have been a lot of good things, and the hero talents are something that are interesting and fun to play. But we've definitely focused on, like, the criticism of it, right? Because obviously we care about it and we like and we'll talk about it. But I still do think that we have done that Warriors still has been improving and is interesting going forward with the changes and with the concerns that have been brought up. But yeah, anyway, that should do it. Once again, Archie and Dan, thank you very much for hanging out with me talking about Warrior stuff. I really appreciate you guys being here, and I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It was a blast.
Likewise.
Well, I guess this is the signing off. So, hope you guys have a good day, and you a good night, Mr. Dan. And I will see you when I see it.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Yeah, have fun.
Peace.